Good morning. We are going to continue the chapter Shakespeare's Sister, written by Virginia Woolf. I think all of you remembered well. This is his third chapter from her very famous essay, A Room of One's Own. A Room of One's Own is considered the first major work in feminist criticism. Woolf analyzes women's struggle as artists, their position in literary history, and their need for independence, citing Bronte sisters and Jane Austen as examples. By incorporating real and fictional people into the essay, Woolf tries to find an answer to the historical and contemporary questions regarding women's art and social position. A Room of One's Own is considered the first major work in feminist criticism. We already discussed this point. Through this work, Woolf examines women's struggle as artists. What is their position in literary history? She also speaks about their need for independence by saying the life of Bronte sisters and Jane Austen. She added real and fictional characters in her essay. Through these characters, she is questioning regarding women's art and social position in the society. Woolf says that it is the gender consciousness of both women and men that cripple their creative genius. Men derogate women to safeguard their dominance in the society, whereas women become angry and insecure about their inferior status. According to Woolf, a real genius should possess an androgynous mind so that their writing will reflect both male and female feelings. She also speaks about the gender consciousness among both women and men. She reminds us this gender consciousness will affect the creative genius of women and men. Men always devalue women to safeguard their dominance in the society. At the same time, women become angry and they felt they are insecure because of their inferior status. According to Woolf, a real genius should possess an androgynous mind. Androgynous means partly male and partly female. So she reminds us the writers should reflect both male and female feelings. Then only they can express their genius through their works. Actually, it is a good message for all the writers. Shakespeare's Sister comprises the third chapter of the whole work. The narrator alludes to history to dig the facts so as to find out the relationship between women and literature. It deals with the differences between women represented in fiction and women in history. It also tells us about the condition of Shakespeare's sister. I think all of you remembered well. We are going through the third chapter, Shakespeare's Sister, in Virginia Woolf's very famous essay, A Room of One's Own. In this chapter, she is digging the facts from history to find out the relationship between women and literature. At the moment, she identifies the reality there are differences between women represented in fiction and women in history. That's why she created an imaginary character, Shakespeare's sister, in this chapter to state that there are differences between women represented in fiction and women in history. Woolf begins the chapter by analyzing the condition of women in the Elizabethan era. Elizabethan era, which is hailed as the golden era of English literature, had many male poets, sonneteers, playwrights and prose writers. But the same era did not witness even one female writer, at least for namesake. So Woolf thought of analyzing the history of women who lived in that era. When she examined the women's work in Elizabethan era, she didn't get any works of women. That's why she started to analyze the condition of women in the Elizabethan era. Actually, the Elizabethan era, it is praised as the golden era of English literature. We can see that there were many men. They already wrote poems, sonnets, plays and also prose. Then what happened to women? They didn't write at least a word for namesake. So she decided to examine the life of women in Elizabethan era. The narrator is disappointed at not having found an unquestionable statement on why women are poorer than men. She decides to investigate women in Elizabethan England, puzzled why there were no women writers in that fertile literary period. She believes there is a deep connection between living conditions and creative works. She reads a history book and finds that women had few rights in the era, despite having strong personalities, especially in works of art. The narrator finds no material about middle class women in the history book, and a host of her questions remain unanswered. So we can see that when she listened the unquestionable statement, why women are poorer than men, why they can't prove their abilities just like men. Actually, they don't have any abilities like men. Women are poorer than men. When she listened this statement, unquestionable statement, she became disappointed. What is the reason behind it? She became confused when she heard this statement. What is the reason? Why no women writers in that fertile literary period? So she strongly believes that there is a deep connection between living conditions and creative works. So she started to read the history. Unfortunately, she didn't get the details and rights of women in that era. She also understood there is no material about middle class women in the history book. So she had a lot of questions in her mind. She didn't get any answers for these questions. How it happened? Men could write poems, sonnets, plays, etc. But what happened to women? Why they couldn't write in a word? Then what about their life in that era? She didn't get any evidence from history. Then we can move to the second paragraph. In second paragraph, we can see that Virginia Woolf started to think that what happened the women in Elizabethan period. Why no women wrote a word when every other man was capable of song or sonnet. So she asked many questions by herself. What were the conditions in which women lived? She describes fiction as being connected to life but as delicately as a spider web, and in Shakespeare's case almost imperceptibly. We can see that fiction is like a spider's web, attached ever so lightly perhaps, but still attached to life at all four corners. She compared fiction as a spider web. The spider web, we already knew it. It makes in the corners. So definitely like that, fiction has connection with the real life. But in Shakespeare's case, it is almost imperceptible. It is almost invisible. By turning from fiction, the art of artifice, to history, the art of facts, the narrator finds that women are just as poor in life as in literature. It is not just that they are missing from the spines of the library books as authors, but that they are missing from the books themselves as individual subjects. In fact, she describes whole history of womanhood, vast as it must be, as a kind of black hole beside the extensive and well documented history of manhood. So she started to examine the fiction, the art of facts. Then she finds that women are just as poor in life, even in literature. She didn't get any word of women. She also identified women are missing from the shelves of the library books. Even she didn't get any details of their life. She identified the reality. In history, women were avoided. But we can see that history of men was well documented. Then what happened to women? Why they didn't add the details of women in the history? It is a virtue of Shakespeare's plays. She observes that they seem like enchanted spider webs to hang there complete by themselves. In reality, however, even his works are not spun in mid-air by incorporeal creatures, but are the real work of suffering human beings and are attached to grossly material things like health and money and the houses we live in. I already told you, fiction is like a spider's web. When she observes the virtue of Shakespeare's plays, she felt the magic spell of spider's webs. She already understood Shakespeare's characters are not imaginary creatures. These characters are the real work of suffering human beings. These characters are attached to noticeable material things like health and money and the houses we live in. When we go through Shakespeare's plays, we will get the real life because he is sharing the experiences, the sufferings of human beings with the material things like health and money and the houses we live in. But she didn't get the clear picture of women in that Elizabethan period. Then we can move to the third paragraph. She took out Professor Trevelyan's History of England to find out the position of women in the history of Elizabethan England. Woolf was astounded to know what reality was. Virginia Woolf took the History of England written by Professor Trevelyan. Who is Trevelyan? He is an English historian, the writer of the History of England. So she wanted to collect the details of women in Elizabethan period. She started to go through Trevelyan's History of England to find out the position of women in the Elizabethan period. Then Woolf was surprised or shocked to know what the reality was. Why she became shocked? Actually, what was the reality? Wife beating was the recognized right of man, and it was practiced by the poor as well as the wealthy. The daughter who refused to marry the person of the parents' choice could be locked up and beaten by the parents. Marriage was not the outcome of love between two persons. Instead, daughters were married off to uphold the family's honor. Child marriages were not news at all. Women were puppets in the hands of men. So I think all of you got the answer why she became shocked. Wife beating was the recognized right of men in that period. No one was ready to question him why you beated your wife. We can see that wife beating was practicing not only in the poor but also in the wealthy. There was no class difference in this case. Parents had the responsibility to find out the partners for their daughters. If any daughter who refused to marry that particular person of the parents' choice, definitely they could be locked up and beaten by the parents. The daughters didn't have their own voice to select their partners. If they raised their voice against their parents' choice, definitely they would be locked up and beaten by the parents. So marriage was not the outcome of love between two persons. Actually, the marriages were uphold the family's honor, because the parents, they wanted to highlight their family's honor. They gave importance to protect their family's honor. They didn't give any importance to their own daughters' lives. Another important thing, child marriages were not news at all. We can see that girls at 15 or 16, they were forced to marry. No one was ready to question on child marriages. As the result, women became the puppets in the hands of men. They were controlled by men. Woolf also examined the position of women in 200 years later in the time of the Stuarts. She got the same result relating their life. I think if you remembered well, actually she was examining the life of women in Elizabethan period. Then she became shocked by understanding the wife beating. So she started to examine 200 years later in the time of Stuarts. At the time also she got the same result. The narrator goes again to books, this time a history of England, and finds a mere few facts about women over the span of centuries, and these all involve men in some way. The impression one gets of women from reading Trevelyan's history book is of a creature that only really exists in the realms of marriage and divorce. There are legal descriptions of men's rights related to their wives, but of women themselves practically nothing. Then the narrator conjures the fictional realm where women have a far more colorful, noticeable existence. She implies that the real woman of history is somewhere in between these two realms. When Woolf examines Trevelyan's history of England, she didn't get facts about women over these centuries. Actually, Trevelyan spoke about men in detail. He spoke about the marriage and divorce. Trevelyan also recorded the legal descriptions of men's rights related to their wives. But she didn't find any legal descriptions of women's rights related to their husbands. From that we can easily understand women didn't have any rights in that period. We can see the discrimination in the case of laws also. But at the same time, when she examined the fiction, she saw the presence of women. She identified very powerful women throughout fiction. Then she already understood the real woman of history is somewhere in between these two realms. That's why she stated that there are differences between women in history and women in fiction. Because in history, Trevelyan didn't speak about the rights of women. At the same time, in fiction, we can see very powerful women characters. That's why she declared we should find out the real position of women, the real life of women in that period. Yet, women were not lacking in personality, claims the historian. When you look at Shakespeare's plays, this is obvious. Cleopatra, Desdemona, all are full of character. A fascinating inconsistency appears in the female sex. In the imagination, she is astounding and varied. In life and in history, she is the property of her husband and basically invisible. Then we already understood we didn't get any details of women from history. But when you look at the Shakespeare's plays, we can see that a lot of powerful women characters. All the women characters were fascinating. Inconsistency. When we go through the characters Cleopatra, Desdemona, definitely we felt that they are very powerful. But in the case of real life, women were just the property of her husband. But this reality was not recorded in history and also in fiction. But women in fiction were the other way round. The characters like Clytemnestra, Antigone, Cleopatra, Lady Macbeth, Desdemona, Cressida, Phaedra, Rosalind, the Duchess of Malfi, Millamant, Clarissa, Becky Sharp, Anna Karenina, Emma Bovary, and many others had a personality and a character of their own. Imaginatively, she is given higher position. She pervades poetry from cover to cover, but practically she has no value at all. Professor Trevelyan points out she was locked up, beaten, and flung about the room. So we can see very powerful characters throughout the fiction, but in reality they were just the property of their husbands. In fact, Professor Trevelyan points out a woman was locked up, beaten, and flung about the room. They were always controlled by men. Then we can move to the next paragraph. Woolf writes, she dominates the lives of kings and conquerors in fiction. In fact, she was the slave of anybody whose parents forced a ring upon her finger. Some of the most inspired words, some of the most profound thoughts in literature fall from her lips. In real life, she could hardly read, could scarcely spell, and was the property of her husband. These lines are very important. Woolf writes, when we go through fiction, we can see that women characters dominate in the lives of kings and conquerors. In reality, woman was the slave of anybody who married them. They were forced to exchange a ring by their parents. They didn't have the voice to select their own partners. Before the marriage, they were controlled by their parents. After the marriage, they were controlled by their husbands. When we go through the powerful women characters in fiction, we feel goosebumps because of their inspired words and their most profound thoughts. But in real life, they could not get the chance to read, spell, and write. They were just the property of their husbands. History turns up little except a few brief statements about the legal rights of women in the early modern period. The silence on the topic of women and the fact of her utter powerlessness strikes discordantly with the prevalence in literature of complex and strong female characters from ancient times to the present. A very queer composite being thus emerges. When we go through the history, we can't get the statements about the legal rights of women in the early modern period. I already told you, history is already recorded. The legal rights of men. We will not get any details of the legal rights of women. So, this silence on the topic of women and the fact of her utter powerlessness strikes the disagreement with the widespread in literature of complex and strong female characters from ancient times to the present. They were avoided from the history because they didn't have any voice in that era. But at the same time, they were created as a complex and a strong female characters in fiction. That's why we can see the disagreement in fiction while we are making the comparison with the history. When we talk about the present situation, we can see that women are very powerful in literature, but at the same time they were exploited very badly around us. So a very pure composite being thus emerges. Imaginatively, she is of the highest importance. Practically, she is completely insignificant. Some of the most inspired words, some of the most profound thoughts in literature fall from her lips. In real life, she could hardly read, could scarcely spell, and was the property of her husband. In light of this paradox, the solution to the problem of trying to conceptualize the Elizabethan woman seems to be to pool the resources of history and fiction. In fiction, they gave the highest importance to women. But in real life, she was completely insignificant. They didn't get any importance. So, in fiction, we can see that the most inspired words and the most profound thoughts fall from their lips. But in real life, they were controlled by men. They didn't get the chance to read, spell, and write. So, in light of this paradox, Virginia Woolf wanted to give a solution to this problem. That's why she tried to conceptualize the Elizabethan woman. She also understood we will get the real life of women in between the history and fiction. She started to find out the reality. This is the confused view that we get after reading women in history and women in fiction. Woolf tells us to think imaginatively and poetically at the same time. That she is Mrs. Martin, aged 36, dressed in blue, wearing a black hat and brown shoes, but not losing sight of fiction either. That she is a vessel in which all sorts of spirits and forces are coursing and flashing perpetually. She goes through Professor Trevelyan's history to find out what history meant to him. So we will be confused when we go through the women in history and women in fiction, because we will get a different concept. We can see that very strong women in fiction. That's why Woolf tells us to think imaginatively and poetically at the same time. Because in fiction, we can see a character, Mrs. Martin, aged 36, dressed in blue, wearing a black hat and brown shoes. But in reality, women didn't get any importance. No one was ready to think about her age, their dressing style, like that. But in fiction, each and every details relating women were narrated. About her dressing style, about her age. But in history, she was completely avoided. What a contradiction. But in fiction, women were created as powerful characters. They have their own souls. They have the power to flow and flash without any end. They had the freedom in their life. That's why she wanted to examine the history, and she is trying to find out through history what did Professor Trevelyan want to speak. What is his real intention to write the history? We will go through the details of Professor Trevelyan's history in our next class. We completed the first paragraph in page number 6. I hope all of you understood the major points we discussed in this chapter. So all of you please go through the textbook well. We will continue the chapter in our next class. Thank you.